Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have a wrap up of last weekend's Yarnover event here in Minneapolis. I'll share what's on my needles at the moment, and I have a review of a stitch dictionary that I'll be giving to a knitter who is approaching her 1-year knitting anniversary. So let's get started. This tidbit came to me from Regia. It's a video from a news station in Vancouver, Canada about a concept called little fiber libraries. These micro libraries are similar to little free libraries that you see in people's front yards by the curb that have books people can take or leave. But in this case, it's tools and materials related to the fiber arts like knitting or crocheting. There might be knitting needles or crochet hooks, yarn, that sort of thing, books that can help people get started in their crafting. The idea comes from a yarn shop owner who wanted to help people get started with crafting during the pandemic. So I'll leave a link to the video, but also to the yarn shop's website where there's a map showing where all the little fiber libraries are located in Vancouver. The libraries can be stocked with donations of yarn and tools, and there are even neighborhood grants to help people get items to offer in their fiber libraries, and tips for getting started if you want to host one of these yourself. Links, of course, are down in the show notes. In the last Casual Friday, Season 6, Episode 32, I shared a Welsh idiom, which I'll put on the screen. Several people told me how to pronounce it, and I just can't do it. I can't do it. But what the expression means is that something is in the works or in progress. But literally, it means it's on the knitting needles. So I got a couple of comments from viewers who had similar idioms in their languages, but with a little twist. So first, from Winterlinda 5395, they said, in German, we have mit heißen Nädeln gestrickt, which translates to knitted with hot needles. So if something is knitted with hot needles, it was made shortly before a deadline, very rushed, and there are probably flaws in it. And it can pertain to anything from homework to federal laws. Then I got a comment from Richard Zobe who said, in Czech and Slovak, we have the same as in German, but related to sewing. So it's sewn with a hot needle. And that term is, again, I'll put it on the screen, ushito horko yelho. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So if you have any similar idioms in your language, please put them down in the comments below and I will share them. And I will probably slaughter your language as badly as I've slaughtered German, Welsh, and Czech. So forgive me. This tidbit came to me from my daughter, Nina. It's a YouTube video from a Korean American knitter contemplating various pattern options for an Aran sweater that she wants to knit. What she really wants to do is to replicate a vintage sweater that she bought off Etsy that was made by a Korean company called Hallim Handweavers. So in her video, she talks a bit about the history of Hallim Handweavers, which I found intriguing, so naturally I had to learn more. Hallim Handweavers was a group of people from the town of Hallim on the island of Jeju, which is just south of the Korean peninsula. They learned to knit and weave as a way to generate income following the several world wars and the Korean War. The fact that they chose Aran sweaters to knit was not really an accident, as there were several Irish priests there on the island helping to get their enterprise going. The history of Aran sweaters only dates back about 100 years ago, so it was really only a couple of decades old when Hallim Handweavers was established. So while Aran sweaters are seen as traditional sweaters of Ireland, their history is really much more complicated than that. They essentially grew out of an effort to help Irish people in rural communities earn money through their knitting and then selling those sweaters to tourists or exporting them worldwide. I'll leave a link to the video down below that my daughter sent me, as well as links to other websites with more about the history of Hallim Handweavers and an article about that complicated history of Aran sweaters. It's not easy to find articles in English about Hallim Handweavers that aren't focusing on the Europeans who were involved in getting the organization going. I would have liked to know more about the women who did all of the knitting and weaving for the company. And I suspect there might be more to learn from articles written in Korean. So if any of you know of any, please let me know down in the comments and send me a link, and then I will Google Translate my heart out in an effort to try to understand them, because I'd really like to know more about this company from the perspective of the knitters. Last weekend was Yarnover, which is the annual Fibre get-together put on by our guild, the Minnesota Knitters Guild. So there are social activities on Friday night and Saturday night. There are classes taught by national instructors on Saturday, as well as a marketplace. And then on Sunday is our annual post-state fair guild meeting featuring items our members entered into the fair, which allows us to hear what the judges' comments were, and then we can also see some of those items up close and personal, where before we only saw them behind the glass cases. Something that was really fun for me at Yarnover was seeing a number of my viewers who either stopped by my Ask a Master Hand Knitter table on Friday night, or who saw me wandering around the marketplace on Saturday or sitting and knitting in one of the hotel lobby chairs. There were at least 2 people who told me who I was. You're Roxanne Richardson, which I always think is fun when somebody says that. I always like to visit the Yarnover marketplace, but I am long past the days of impulse yarn purchases, buying something just because it's pretty. I have learned over the years that impulse purchases rarely result in projects, which means I then just have to get rid of the yarn later. But if there is something that I've been wanting to knit and I find the perfect yarn for it, then I will grab it. So there's always a lot of local and regional dyers and mills represented in the marketplace. So it's a great place to see unique things that can only be found in our region, and to find out what those people are doing, so that when I do need something and I want something special from one of them, I'll know where to look. What I tend to look for and buy at these marketplaces are things that are knitting related, but that aren't yarn. So I can't wear sweaters in the summertime, so I'm always on the lookout for fun t-shirts, and I never know when I'm going to run across one. If I see one in a yarn shop, that's something I will absolutely buy on impulse. Sometimes I want to buy interesting buttons for a sweater, and there's always a woman there at Yarnover who is a member of the Minnesota Button Society, and she has vintage buttons. So sometimes I've made a cardigan and I want to get special buttons, and I'll go visit her booth. Or I might want to look out for something like a basket or other item that could be of use in my office. So I did pick a few things up. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you what I got at Yarnover. The very first booth I saw when I walked in the doors of the marketplace was this one, which is Knit Ba Pearl is the name of her company, and I believe she's a graphic artist. So she has things like note cards, greeting cards, mugs, water bottles, t-shirts, tote bags, notions, all different kinds of things. And just a ton of different colors and a ton of different images that are really fun, like this one that says lay flat to dry, which I love. Then I got this one as well, which was Shipwreck, which I love. There were a few other designs that I really liked, but they didn't have them in my size and color combination, so I couldn't get them. But you probably can get whatever you want if you order directly from her. I assume she has a website, and I will put it down in the show notes. But again, it's called Knit Ba Pearl is the name of her company. One place I always stop at Yarnover is a booth. I can't even remember the name of it, something or other antiques. but she is a member of the Minnesota Button Society, and so she has all kinds of antique and vintage buttons. So if I'm ever in the market for buttons at Yarnover, I always go to her booth. And I wasn't in the market for buttons, but I did want to stop at the booth. Her neighbor always helps her, and her neighbor is a friend of mine that I've known for 20 years, so I hadn't seen her in a couple of years, so I got to see her. But she had on display some vintage pattern books, which I always want to look through. And one of the things that I always pick up is any kind of book that teaches how to knit. And so this is a learn how book, handwork at your fingertips. So that it has knitting, it has crochet, well, it has at the bottom crochet, knitting, tatting, embroidery, hairpin lace. And I don't have one with this cover. I may actually have this book, but published or reprinted at another date. I'm going to have to look through my vintage books to be sure, because I do have some that have quite a few different techniques, but I know I don't have this cover. This was apparently published in 1940. So it's got all of the techniques for, you know, how do you do all the different crochet stitches, and it has projects for making those things, how to increase, some fancy stitches, doilies, all of those kind of things. And we've got some, you know, Afghan stitch, what's that? Now we've got the knitting section. So this is what I always want to see is like, how are they telling people to cast on? So they've got method 1, knitting on, which is also called a 2-needle cast on. And method 2 is using 1 needle. So that's the long tail cast on. And they're demonstrating using the continental method where you have both strands in the same hand, in your left hand. So it's nice that they've got some really clear photographs, because 1940, you'll get photographs, but sometimes you might get one, or sometimes you might get drawings. And even today, sometimes drawings are a little clearer to follow, but certainly early on in the century, if there was a drawing at all, there would be one. First project, you've got a scarf with fringe. You got to learn how to purl. Love this hat. That's not a knitted hat, but I love the hat. That's a cute little sweater, just your classic short sleeve stockinette sweater made in Shetland floss. So, you know, something that is, let's see, 7 stitches per inch, so like a fingering weight yarn. Explaining about gauge, how to do yarn overs. They're talking about circular needles. A lot of people think that circular needles are a relatively new invention, and they are not. They came out in the 1920s. They just weren't very good, and so people weren't using them very often. Double-pointed needles, buttonholes, picking up stitches, and then we move on into other crafts like tatting. Let's see what else they might have in here. Embroidery stitches. So then they've got all of the classic embroidery stitches in here. So it's a nice little how-to book. It's always amazing to me how much information they could put in something that is this size. And they even have information on how to block and finish your hand knits, which is very nice. That is a lot of T-pins. That is a lot of T-pins. I did have in mind some yarn that I wanted to pick up. It's something that I've been looking for a couple of years. Whenever I go to a place where, you know, I'm not ready to cast on and I need a specific yarn, I'm just going to a marketplace. I'm always looking for yarn that I could use for this type of a sweater, these traditional Danish sweaters. So the traditional Danish sweaters are really sort of the original wool knitted shirts that were worn not just as underwear, but that were worn as part of their costumes. So it was something that was worn all of the time, and it was part of the costume. And so you can see bits and pieces of it in different places. And so early on, they were very short, and then later centuries, they got longer. These just have an incredibly long history. They're sort of the more common person's adaptation of the silk shirts, like Charles, I don't remember if it's the first or the second, who was executed, and he was wearing a silk, they called it a waistcoat. It was this kind of undershirt thing that had an elaborate knit purl pattern in it. but it was silk, and so that was something the aristocracy would wear. And so that style went over into like Denmark, and then it was adapted into wool at slightly coarser gauges, meaning like 7 stitches per inch instead of, you know, something crazy like 12 or something. So this book, you know, has some history of it, characteristics of the sweaters, explaining certain special stitch patterns that are used in some of these designs, and then this incredible stitch dictionary of the different types of stitch patterns that you might find, so that you can sort of build your own traditional Danish sweater. And this is something I've been wanting to do. Now, there are some sweater patterns in here, but these are patterns like that her students have designed and made, and so they made them for their own bodies. So they come in one size and they have all of the information, but it's in one size. And so she gives you all of the information about, you know, how you construct something like this and how you design something like this. But I really like this, this little green sweater here. I really like, there's a few of them in here that I like quite a lot. And so it needs a fingering weight yarn. I always have sweaters quantities of worsted weight yarn, but not fingering weight yarn. So that was something that I was looking for when I went to Yarnover. Did I look up the quantity that I was going to need? I did not. And so I just decided that my memory was accurate and that I would need 3. So I stopped at this booth. This is a local dyer. It's Regia Fibres, and their yarns are yak down, Tibetan yak down. And so I found a color I liked, and I bought 3 skeins. And then I came home and I looked in the book and I realized I would need 4. So I contacted the seller to find out if they, you know, had any more, and she's been doing shows every weekend, so she couldn't lay her hands on it. Her inventory said she had another skein, but she couldn't find it. And so she said if she couldn't find it, the next time she dyes up a batch so that they would all be in the same dye lot, I could exchange these 3 for 4 that matched. So that's what I'm going to do. My monitor is not showing this color true. Greens and blue greens can be really hard. This is just this really beautiful sort of dark teal color, and I really like it. And so at some point I will be making my Danish night sweater. I also have my hand spun sweater I need to design and knit. So one of those 2 is going to go first, but then I'm going to want to do the Danish night sweater, something I've been wanting to do literally for years. Now, the last thing I picked up is not something I purchased. I got into a conversation with the president of the guild, who had been given a bunch of old yarn several years ago, and they've been stored in bins, and she just moved, and she's like, I don't want, they stink. And she's like, how do I get the stink out? And she described it as a musty smell. And so the next day when we had our guild meeting, for the Yarnover weekend, she brought me a skein. And so my plan for this is to do an experiment. I'm going to divide this up into mini skeins, and I'm going to try a few different things to see if we can get the smell out. She had described the smell as musty, and I don't know if that's what I'm smelling. Other people were smelling it, said, no, it just smells old. And, you know, things shouldn't smell just because they're old. So I'm going to try a few different things. I've done a lot of research, and I'm trying to see what would actually work. So that's something that I'm going to be doing in the coming weeks. This label was pinned to the fabric, or to the skein. It wasn't tied on. It is a product of Canada. Condon's yarn, 100% wool from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. But this will be an interesting experiment. I've always in the past, if yarn smelled really bad, I just threw it out. She's trying to rescue this because she's got a lot of yarn in sweaters quantities. And so if it can be saved, then she's got a lot of yarn and a lot of sweaters that she can knit. But if it can't, then she's going to have to get rid of it. So that's going to be an experiment that will be coming up. Let me know down in the comments if you have done something to get smell out of yarn that actually worked. So like the smell of smoke probably can be washed out, but something that's musty, That's going to be mildew. That's a fungus. So it's the fungus, the living organism, is what's creating that smell. So you can't get rid of the smell unless you kill it. But I'm going to try a few different things. So if you know something besides vinegar, vodka, just heat for killing and getting rid of smells that you have actually tried, because I can Google, but it's something that you have actually tried that actually worked, let me know. Last year, when we went to the Netherlands, I taught my daughter Nina to knit. And she has just taken off with her knitting, completely fearless in what she makes. She's made multiple sweaters and tops and a skirt and various accessories. She even got a job at a yarn shop this past spring. So she is thoroughly obsessed. As I mentioned, she's been knitting sweaters. She started early on. One of her very first projects was a little crop sweater project, and she's modified things to add different stitch patterns or motifs. So I have no doubt that she will be able to design her own things in the very near future. But for the past few months, as we've been planning this trip, I've been asking them if, is there anything you want us to bring from the US? Are there any like products or anything that you miss, anything you want? And I also asked if there was anything that Nina wanted for her knitting. But now that she works at a yarn shop, she can pretty much get whatever she needs for the most part and at a discount. She did lose the one tape measure that she had that has inches and centimeters. So I've got her covered there. I got her, I've got 5 different tape measures for you, because she's going to lose them again. And even if you don't really think you've lost something, you can always find a tape measure. You can't have too many tape measures. So I've got her covered there. But a few days ago, she sent me a text asking if I have any stitch dictionaries that I might want to donate to her. So I have quite a few stitch dictionaries, and by quite a few, I mean somewhere between 30 and 50, depending on whether you're talking about books that are nothing but stitch patterns or books about a specific type of knitting that includes projects plus a big section of different stitch patterns. So I have a lot of them, but I couldn't think of a single one that I thought would be useful to her and that I would be happy to part with. And here's why. A lot of the stitch dictionaries are ones that are classics, like Barbara Walker's Treasuries of Stitch Patterns from the 1970s. Some of them are more recent. Walker's are all in black and white pictures, pretty small. They're all written for flat knitting. So if you want to work in the round, you have to convert the instructions or create a chart from them. And you have to, there's some work to do. And I have made videos on this. I did a series of videos, or a couple of videos anyway, last December on how to do that, how to convert stitch patterns. So I just routinely rechart everything I knit, whether there's already a chart or not. So that's part of my process, but I didn't think that was something I really wanted to impose on a newer knitter. And so I did think of one book that might be really useful, that I actually have used a number of times and I really like. That is the Knit Stitch Pattern Handbook. It's by Melissa Liebman. It's got 800 stitch patterns. So they're all knit purl types of things. There's cables and all those kinds of things. There's no color work in here. But, they've got color photos in them. They've got written instructions, plus they have charts for each of these, and those charts can be interpreted for flat knitting or in the round, depending on which you're going to be doing. Because typically when you're knitting flat, you might end up with stitches that are there to create symmetry, where when you're knitting in the round, you're going to be working full repeats. So there is some differences between how you would do those with a chart. So I thought this style of book would be really good for her. It's out of print. It's, you can buy them used or from different sellers. When you buy things used, they send it by media mail, and that can take a while. And I didn't want to risk not buying her a copy or taking this one to her and buying myself a used one and then having it arrive when we're out of town. I didn't want to do that. So I started looking around for something that might still be in print. And what I found was this book here, Vogue Knitting, the Ultimate Stitch Dictionary. So Vogue puts these large format books out. They're hardcover, they have color photos, and when they call it the ultimate whatever, they are trying to be all things to all knitters. So this is the ultimate, the Vogue Ultimate Knitting book. So this one has all of the basics of knitting, all the basic knit stitches, all the different decreases and increases, how cables work, examples of that. And then they even launch into designing. So literally meant for very beginner all the way up to designing things and making modifications or adding embellishments, whatever. So that's what you can expect from a Vogue knitting book. Do I think it's the only knitting book any knitter should have? No, but if you need to get one to get your library started, this is not a bad option. So I do have a Vogue Knitting Stittionary, which they call the Ultimate Stitch Dictionary from the editors of Vogue Knitting magazine. So this one is quite a few years old. And so it's nice in that it's got color photos of the stitch patterns, but those are written directions only for flat knitting. So this is the kind of thing that isn't going to be as useful to my daughter because she, like a lot of contemporary knitters, only wants to knit in the round, or the patterns that she's choosing are in the round, you know, seamless construction. I wanted her to have a stitch dictionary that she didn't have to do any conversions. So that's what this stitch dictionary is aiming to be, is again, all things to all knitters. So let's go to the overhead and I'll kind of go through the book and show you what's in it so you can understand what it's like and if it's something that you might want to add to your knitting library. So my expectation was that they were all going to be texture, but that is not the case. They have each chapter is color coded. So chapter 1 is things with knit purl stitches. And so all of the swatches are in some shade of green in here. So they've got, you know, a bunch of different knit purl patterns in here, which are nice for creating textures, whether it's something you want to put in a hat or a sweater, or if you, a lot of these are going to lie flat because they'll balance the knits and purls, so you could use them for a scarf or a cowl or something like that. So they have the knit purl section, and then the red section is color work, and that was the one that surprised me. So I have a bunch of different kinds. They've got some that are stranded, and you'll notice, of course, for the color they're using charts, but even for the texture they're using charts, and they have the written instructions. So you can use either one, and that was what I was really looking for my daughter. And they have a stitch key next to every single chart. It isn't one stitch key somewhere else in the book that you have to go look things up. So that's nice. So they have all different kinds of color work in here. A lot of it is stranded, and so you'll have you know, and they put these in the charts in color as well, which can be handy if you want to use those colorways. But if you're switching things, sometimes it can be a lot of mental gymnastics to figure that out. These are more like intarsia types of things, and those are kind of hard to find in stitch dictionaries. You can find them in individual patterns, and some pattern books are full of intarsia patterns. But I think it's difficult to create a stitch dictionary that is intarsia motifs. And there aren't a whole lot of them in here, but they do have some things that are various motifs. They've also got other kinds of color work like slip stitch patterns. Some of them are just texture patterns where you change colors within the texture. So this is like stranded color work, but it also includes some texture in it. So this is kind of an interesting taste of different ways of doing color work. And we've got some mosaic in here as well. So there's a lot of variety. We've got some brioche stitches. So this is a really interesting section, I think, is this color work section, because it really has a lot of diversity in terms of the types of color work. So it's not going to be completely extensive, but it's going to give you a taste of all the different types of color work there are, so that you could then go and look for others. So we've got a chapter on cables, and this chapter Everything is some shade of brown. So they've got some that use twisted stitch patterns, some that are just, traveling patterns, some that are stockinette based, all kinds of interesting patterns. And in this case, if it's something with a repeat, they will show you like where the repeat is. Like there's the red lines here, and then it jogs over to show you where the repeat is. That's nice with the chart. So they've got the flat instructions, but then they've got them charted, and you could use these whether you were knitting flat or in the round. So that I think is a really important in a stitch dictionary in this day and age. So a lot of great, I always love looking at cable patterns because that's one of my favorite things to knit. So we've got the cable section, and then the next section is lace. So these are all in shades of blue, and so they have like kind of like the all over eyelet types of lace patterns, and then you start getting into you've got some panels. They start getting more intricate as you go. Lots of different, so it's an interesting panel right here that you could put in, and some things are all over repeat patterns. So they also have in this lace chapter, they'll have, there's your feather and fan family of stitches. They also have some things that are kind of hybrids of cables and lace. So you have lace, but lace that is also cable. And those are always interesting, I think. So they've got quite a few of those in here. Lots of interesting stitch patterns. There's one that I think is so cool. This one right here. Let me show you up close. I love the way that this cable twists in the middle. Like it just kind of flips. Oh, I think that is just so cool. I love that a lot. And then you have a chapter on edging. So these are really good. Little lace edgings, bobbles, just like triangular edgings, how to do different kinds of ruffles, a lot of different ruffle patterns in here. All of the little cords and things that are dangling, those are kind of cool. And then they have edgings that are colorwork. So they've got corrugated ribbing, ribbed stripes, how to do that. They've got all kinds of other things that you might use for a border, like you could use that on a mitten cuff, something like that. So cable edgings. So they're going back through the book with all of the different sections, and then having those be different edgings. So we've got lace edgings as well. So it's overall, I think it's a really great resource, but it really does have quite a lot of possibilities. And it's really nice that it's in color, that they have written instructions, and that they have things charted. And those charts allow you to see how to knit that in the round with the repeats, or the edge stitches for symmetry if you're going to be knitting something flat. So I think this is a pretty decent book, and I'm glad that this is the book that I'm going to take to my daughter. I think that'll be a good foundational book for her own personal knitting library. It's starting to cool down here in Minnesota, which means my knitting engine is firing up. But I'm not ready to start a big project just yet. My hand spun yarn isn't finished yet, and I need to design the sweater I'm going to knit with it. And I need to get a 4th skein of that yak down yarn that I got at Yarnover, or exchange the 3 that I have for 4 that are all from the same dye lot. So that's going to take a while. I can't start anything yet until I know where I'm going to get that 4th skein from. I don't want to break into one if I'm going to have to return them all. So I've been knitting a lot of little projects lately, a couple of headbands so that my ears don't ache when I ride my bike. And now I'm frantically knitting socks for my daughter Nina and her fiance Sam before we head to the Netherlands for a visit in the very near future. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you the socks I'm working on. Everyone gets their fun in different ways. These days when it comes to sock knitting, well, self-striping sock yarn I've loved since the beginning. But one of the things I've been doing the past couple of years is using a very specific type of heel so that I can preserve the striping pattern all the way down the leg, and also so that when I get to the heel, that the striping sequence continues, even though the stripes are going to be different widths, that the striping sequence comes down to the heel, and then it continues on here, and then when I'm knitting the foot, it's also a continuation at the same location in the colorway, and so that it continues down the foot as well. So the way I do that is that I use a type of heel that's called a plain heel. So if you look at this, you might think, oh, that's an afterthought heel. Essentially, it is the same in many ways. There are some differences. The main one being that when you are knitting a plain heel, you knit it at the time that you get to the heel. You don't wait until later to come back to it. When you have the length of the heel of the leg that you want, you put the front half of the stitches on waste yarn. So I've got it on this green yarn right here. Then you do a provisional cast on. And what I tend to do is use this waste yarn and use it for a long tail cast on. So this green yarn is used as the thumb yarn for a long tail cast on, and then I just continue using the sock yarn I've been using to create the stitches on the needle. So at that point, these are the stitches for the back of the leg that have been there. I cast on these stitches right here, and then I can work this heel just like I would any other peasant heel, whether it was an afterthought heel or a forethought heel. What's nice about the plain heel is that when you are casting on stitches, you do not have to cast on the same number of stitches that you have on hold. And because I need my heel modifications to accommodate my heel diagonal, I cast on more stitches, so that when I'm starting the heel, this half of the heel has more stitches than this half. So when I'm starting my decreases, I'm only working decreases on this half of the heel every other round until the number of stitches that are remaining on the needle are the same as what I have here. And then I can switch to every other round doing 4 decreases. So 2 decreases on each half of the heel until I get down to the end. So like I said, this is called a plain heel, and I have done videos on this. There's I think 2 videos on the plain heel. The first one is just to treat it like a regular peasant heel where there isn't a difference in the 2 halves, and then the second one is how you do the modifications, because there's a spreadsheet that lets you calculate how many you're going to need for the foot that you are knitting for. So once the heel is done, then you can recapture these stitches that are here. The long tail cast on was done in this direction right here. So when I'm recapturing stitches, I'm looking at this cast on edge, and I just grab the right leg of each of those stitches all the way across. And once those are on the needle, then I can just snip this out. You can use other provisional cast-ons. I find that, and I have tried it with different provisional cast-ons, but this just works really well for me, in part because I can start out with the waste yarn, putting stitches on hold, and then just continue using that same waste yarn as the thumb loop. So I find that really handy. So once those stitches are on the needle, I'm in the same situation I was when I started the heel, where this half has more stitches than this half. So if I need the foot to have the same number of stitches as I had for the leg, some people need that and some people need less, or some people need more, then I make a decision about whether or not I need to decrease stitches out. For me and my daughter, we want the same number. So I had 64 stitches for the leg. I've got 32 that were on hold here. I've got 38 that are right here. So when I start working in the round again, I'm going to work 2 decreases every other round until I'm down to that 64 stitches. When I knit for Sam, Nina's fiance, his foot is bigger around than his ankle. So I create the extra stitches that I'm going to need for his foot when I do that cast on, and then I just don't decrease them out when I knit the foot. So there are a lot of different ways to approach this depending on the fit issues. If I had needed more stitches for the leg than I need for the foot, then what I could do is just cast on the same number as I had on hold and then do a decrease, or I could potentially cast on fewer and then do the same thing where I'm only doing decreases on the larger half until they both match the same. So there are a bunch of different ways to deal with this. Now these markers that I have here, these are just helps me count rows. So this is the orange markers are every 25 rounds, and so this 25, this is 50. So then then I go by 10. So I have like 60, 70, and here's 75. So these just help me keep track because I want to work as close to the same number of rounds on both legs if I can, and this just helps me keep track. And I tend to keep track of my progress in the spreadsheet, so I want to know where I am so I know what percentage of the way I am complete. Trick that I also use at the heel is to pay attention to where I am in the particular stripe that's on the needle. And in this case, it was this purple stripe right here that seemed to always be 4 rounds long. And so in the first sock, I noticed that, well, when I had finished 2 rounds of the purple, then I started working on the heel. Then I did my cast on for the heel. Once the heel was done, I wound off yarn because I finished the heel with this gray, and then I was going to go into this part right here, so which was pretty soon after that. So I found the midpoint of this purple, of the purple stripe, and then I used that as my starting point for the leg so that I have the same stripe width in all 3 locations right here, and then the striping pattern would continue down. So this is, like I said, we all get our fun from different places, and that's how I get my fun, keeping spreadsheets to track my progress, making things match exactly, getting a custom fit for the person that I'm knitting for. Those are just things that are fun for me. Now, this toe that I'm using is called a round toe, and there's 2 versions. There's a long round toe, and then there's a short round toe. They both have decreases done the same way. There's like 8 decreases per round, just like with a hat. And for the long round toe, I started out with knit 6, knit 2 together, knit 6, knit 2 together, etc. And then I worked 5 plain rounds, and then I did a decrease round, and then I worked 4 plain rounds, and then I did a decrease round, then 3 plain rounds, did a decrease round, 2 plain rounds, etc. That's the long version of it. The shorter version is that you always work 2 plain rounds after every decrease round. And you can customize that further by making it being a particular length. So I will leave links to videos on this type of toe too. I have videos for the toe up version as well as for the cuff down version. So it will work in either case. And this type of heel can be done in either direction too, because the heel itself is worked exactly the same regardless of which direction you're working in. So I managed to finish that second sock and get these washed, and they hung up to dry overnight. So these are done. So I think this is, this is the first sock. So you can see there's a little bit of pink here at the toe. And then this sock right here just has a tiny bit about, so it's off by a few stitches, but this is a pretty good match. Otherwise, the socks match really well, and I am very happy with them. And these are going to be on Nina's feet very shortly. Nina's not the only one who's going to get socks. I started knitting a pair of socks for Sam, her fiance. I have 2 pairs already completed that I've knit earlier in the year. He saw this. I sent some pictures of what I had in 6-ply. He likes the 6-ply yarn for his socks, and he liked this colorway. So I started this, I think yesterday. So, and because it's 6-ply, it goes really fast. I started this last night, I think at knit night. So hopefully I will have these done before we leave the Netherlands to come back to the US. So this is a project I'm starting before we leave, and I'll probably be working on it as we are on our travels. So I do not want to come back to the US with these socks unfinished and then have to mail them to him or wait until I see him again. That's what I'm currently working on at the moment. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.